stay on so we can stay on schedule. I am going to be introducing our next speaker, and again, meeting you from throughout the day. Today, I am based here in San Antonio and work with the health department in our violence prevention program. And today, I'm pleased to have you join us for the last session of the day in this track, identifying and responding to the risk of lethal violence against children in domestic violence cases. I'm introducing Dr. Katreena Scott, the Director for the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. Dr. Scott is a psychologist, professor, and as I mentioned, director of the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. She leads an applied research program aimed at ending violence in family relationships with specific expertise on addressing violence perpetrated by men. She is internationally known for her research on empirically and ethically sound policies and practices for intervening with men who have used violence against their partners and or their children. She has authored over 40 articles and book chapters on the development of violent relationships, the efficacy of service to male batterers, the effect of abuse and trauma on children, and on empirically and ethically sound policies for working with abuse perpetrators. The Caring Dads program that she developed, which is available at www.caringdads.org, I'll put that in the chat for you, is currently running in many sites across Canada, as well as in the United States, United Kingdom, Ireland, Wales, Germany, Australia, and Sweden. She's a contributor to international networks, including the DV at Work, with at using the at symbol, DV at Work network, and the Safer Families Center of Excellence. In recognition of her contributions to the field, Dr. Scott holds a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Ending Child Abuse and Domestic Violence. Dr. Scott, thank you for joining us today. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Erica. That was a lot of things to get through to talk about at the end of a long online day. Thank you so much for joining, everybody. I would encourage you to use the chat. I will try to keep an eye on it. I know that it's hard to be online in this space and listen for this long. So if there is something that you would like clarification on, or you want to chat about, even amongst yourself, we've got a fairly small group, but I know that you're a dedicated group because you're still here. And I encourage us to just use this as much as possible as an opportunity to share. Erica just introduced me and talked a little bit about some of sort of my academic qualifications. I want to tell you that I was fundamentally trained as a child clinical psychologist. And so that makes this topic, which is identifying and responding to the risk of lethal violence against children in domestic violence cases, one that's really, really close to my heart. So despite the fact that I've spent like a lot of my career working with adults, ultimately my lens is always about what do we need to do to improve the safety and well-being of children. And also in this track, I'll be interested in people's comments and also their any observations they have, because I've over the last 5 or 6 years spent quite a bit of time working with the child welfare services here in Canada to try to do a better job at responding to domestic violence. And I'll show you some of the data from that, and maybe some of that is similar to what's happening for you, and maybe it's different. I don't usually do this, but I am going to start with just giving you a couple of additional resources. One of them, because the topic here is lethal violence, I was involved in editing a book that came out last year called Preventing Domestic Homicides. It's a real book, and it's also an audiobook. Each chapter takes on domestic homicide in a slightly different way. So one chapter is on preventing domestic homicides that involve children. Another one is thinking about domestic homicides that involve military or police personnel. Another one is thinking about domestic homicides in Indigenous populations. So if domestic homicides is something that you're interested in, this book provides a lot of information. And each, I don't know, as we were editing this book, I was like, I'm not sure about this, because each chapter, we've built it so that they involve a case study and the lessons learned from that case study. So if you are going to read this book, I would suggest doing it in chunks. The second thing I wanted to provide you with a little bit of information on in terms of a resource is a website called Family Violence, Family Law, or supporting the health of survivors of family law in family violence and family law proceedings. It's a Canadian initiative that brings together 5 different centers from across Canada with communities of practice to really try to push forward change in the family law system. And this group is putting together and has put together a number of short briefs. So these are small, or supposed to be small, digestible pieces on a variety of different topics, written with a collaboration across community and family law in mind. There's also a number of webinars. All of those webinars are posted. And if you go to the website is at the bottom there, www.fvfl, and then that's the French equivalent to that. You'll find those resources. Okay, so now actually on to the topic that I'm supposed to be talking about, which is identifying and responding to risk of lethal violence against children. I want to start with a quote from Rosie Batty, who is a very important advocate in Australia, whose work has led to a number of changes there. And what Rosie said was, I never want anyone to be sitting where I'm sitting and to have lost a son because I can never get him back. So when we start to think about children killed in the context of domestic violence, I like to think about it in terms of, okay, so what do we know about children killed, period? So we know from UNICEF reports that there are about 95,000 children murdered every year, and that parents are the single most common perpetrators of that murder. The second most common is in adolescents and its peers. Something else is that parents are more common as perpetrators, or a higher proportion of perpetrators in higher income countries are parents than in lower income countries. When we look at those cases, we look at situations where parents have killed their children. The most frequent sort of child homicide is mothers who are implicated mostly in the deaths of very young children, often in the first days or weeks after the child's born. And a lot of those cases are young moms. It's often the case that that people didn't know that mom may have been hiding the pregnancy. People may not have known about it. She often hasn't had any prenatal care. Then the next most common are fathers, and they're most often implicated in the deaths of older children. As many as half of the deaths of older children that are perpetrated by fathers seem to be perpetrated as an act of revenge. So it's in the context of domestic violence and often of separation. If we look now at domestic homicide, we know that at least 7% of those killed in domestic homicides are children, although some estimates put that as high as 15 or 20%. I will also say, and we'll go on to this a little bit more, that children are victims in many, many other ways. So when we looked in Ontario, there's been a domestic violence death review committee that has functioned since 2003. So if we look, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings of that. Here is data that we've been recently looking at. It's 219 Ontario cases that were reviewed by the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee between 2010 and 2020. And in that period, 121 or 55% of the cases involved dependent children. And 12% of those cases, the children were killed. In another 29%, the children were directly involved in the homicide. So they tried to intervene, they ran away, they called. There was some direct involvement of children. And in the other 59%, of course, children heard or witnessed the domestic homicide. If we though then take a step back, we can think about children being impacted because they died, but we can also think about all the other ways children are impacted because no matter what, a domestic homicide has a profound impact on a child's life. They've often lost both parents, one as a result of murder, and then the other because they were the ones that murdered their parent. And so when we think about that, it's inevitable that children are going to be implicated and harmed as a result of domestic homicide in all forms. So we took again those same cases and we looked a little bit broadly and we said, okay, well, how many children were impacted in those 121 cases? And the number that we came up with was 250 children were impacted. 155 of those children, dependent children, were living in the home where of the person who was killed. Another 20 were living in the home sometimes, so they may have had weekend visitations, they may have been there, um, so they may have been in and out of care. There were 54 children who were not living in the home. They were living with other caregivers, but again, those children were impacted by the loss of a parent, and there were 21 whose status was unclear. So what do we know about risks to children? Well, we know that children have been surprisingly, I guess, if you think about, of course, children are impacted. There hasn't been a ton of work on children. There hasn't been a ton of focus on children. In fact, some domestic violence death review committees don't include deaths of children as a domestic homicide if the mom or the father, whoever is the victim of domestic violence, wasn't killed. When we do look at the few studies that have looked at risk for lethality, what they've found is that risk factors for domestic homicide apply equally to children. So predicting all the work that we've done, the tools that we have to predict domestic homicide victimization, period, are equally applicable to understanding risk to children. And so an example of a study that has looked at this is one by Hamilton, Jaffe, and Campbell. And what they did is they compared domestic homicides in homes without children, in homes with children who were not killed, and in homes with children who were killed. And they looked at all the different risk factors that were present in those cases. And what they found is that there was equivalence. So the number of risk factors or the aspect of DV homicide risk was equivalent in those homes without children, with children who were killed, and with children who were not killed. What's I think really sticks with me and makes me feel it and feels very tragic to me is that the one difference that was found between those three groups of cases was that when children were present, more professionals and agencies were involved with the family. So, on average, cases in homes where children were killed had 9.3 different professionals involved in their life over the life of that over the life of the case. In cases where children were not killed, 6.3 different agencies, and in homes without children, 4.1 different agencies on average were involved. So what this does is it adds to that general literature and that general finding that domestic homicides are in fact among the most predictable and preventable form of homicide. So if we look at all of the domestic violence death review cases between 2003 and 2018, what we find is that 70% of those cases had seven, in retrospect, had seven or more risk factors. 15% had 4 to 6 risk factors. And then we have some 13% that have a 1 to 3 and 1% that had no risk factors that the committee could find. And the top 10 risk factors are in Canada are listed here. And so the take home point is if we look at these risk factors, And if we are concerned about a history of domestic violence, if and when we're concerned about depression in a perpetrator, when we are concerned about obsessive behavior or sexual jealousy or prior to threats to kill the victim, we should be asking ourselves as well, what's the risk to children? And one of the things that I've been really advocating for in some of the mental health work that I'm associated with as a clinical psychologist is, all clinical psychologists, like many other mental health professionals, get training in doing suicide risk assessment. But nowhere in my training did anybody say, well, if there's a history of domestic violence, that suicide risk assessment should probably add a question, which is, if you're thinking about killing yourself, if you're in that part of the interview, are you thinking about taking anybody else with you? And that question in and of itself to address the risk of domestic homicide. If we look more broadly at risk factors for domestic homicide, again, knowing that risk to mostly women is the same as risk to children, we know that there are a number of instruments that have high predictive validity. The danger assessment probably being the most well known. Many of the risk factors that I just showed you overlap with the danger assessment, the big difference being a difference between Canada and the US around the presence of guns, and the presence of guns being a really important risk factor in a US context and not so much in a Canadian context. Other instruments with high predictive validity are the spouse assault risk assessment, which is really designed for use for with men or with those who are perpetrating harm. And then there are a couple of domestic violence assault or screening inventories that are also good predictors or highly predictive, have the highest predictive validity when we're trying to think about risk for domestic homicide. As I said, there hasn't been a ton of research on looking specifically at risk to children. I will just say that I have a clinical hunch that if we had a larger data set, there are probably a couple of extra risk factors that I would be paying attention to in addition to the domestic violence ones. And these come from studies of risk for child homicide more generally. The first one I would look at is child age. One of the things that we know is that overall, younger children are more likely to be killed by their parents than older children for a number of different reasons. Partly, younger children are more physically vulnerable. So they're more vulnerable if they are hit or if they are thrown to being killed. They're also less able to take self-protective action. So they're less able to run away. Stepchild status is also a risk factor for death of a child or killing of a child. And of course, prior violence against a child is predictive in general. So my hunch is that those variables would, at least if I was doing it, I'd do a domestic violence risk assessment. I'd think about what we know about domestic violence lethality, and I would be even more concerned if it was a young child, if there were stepchildren in the home, and if there was evidence of prior violence against children. So part of my question for this presentation, part of what I was asked to answer is really that question of, how do we identify and respond to the risk of lethal violence against children? So I'll start then with how well do I identify these risk factors within child welfare services? And so this is a large child protection service in Ontario. And what we did is we looked at 240 cases that were substantiated for child exposure to domestic violence and were transferred to ongoing services. So what does that mean in Ontario context? It means that these were some of the more higher risk cases that were investigated by child welfare services. And I thought it would be interesting for you to see what we found when we looked through the reason for referral, the intake information about these kind of common DV lethality risk indicators. How common were they in these child protection files? Well, it turns out that many of them were pretty common, that the mean number of risk factors in these cases was 3, but there were a good third of the or about a third of the cases that met that cutoff of 7 or more risk factors. And you can see down the side which ones were most common. And I will also mention that this was not a standardized assessment. So this was not, let's look at, child protection workers don't, in Ontario, they don't generally necessarily ask about these questions. These were coded because they appeared somewhere in the file, either from the referral or from the initial intake. And we'll talk later about whether or not they actually came through in the conceptualization of the case. But these are just, were they here, and something that we could see in the file, and we'll see that in child protection they were quite often there. Another review, this time it's in a smaller child welfare agency, and we looked at 10 cases that that they were investigated and not open. They were, there was no, what was said was, there was no verification of concern here. In 3 of those cases, of the 10, so that's 30% of the cases that were not verified, had 4 or more domestic violence lethality in risk indicators when looked at from a domestic violence lens. In those cases that were investigated, verified, and then closed within a month, there were several cases where there was at least 1 or 2 DV lethality risk factors that is included as part of the documentation. But we didn't find a single case where those had been flagged as risk factors. So they were there, but there was no instance in those 10 cases where the worker identified them as, oh, this is something I'm specifically concerned about because I'm worried about risk of lethality or risk of more serious domestic violence. So why were these files closed then? And this is where it will be interesting to see whether or not there's a similarity to what might be happening in Ontario and what might be happening where you are. It's the most common reason these child exposure to domestic violence cases were closed was because the written reason for closing was because the couple had separated. So, for example, somebody might say the risk is mitigated because the couple isn't living together anymore. From a domestic violence lens, we know that separation is in fact a risk factor. It's not a safety factor. The second most common reason was because mothers were acting protectively. So the file's closed because mom is, and often that exact wording is used. Mom is a good mom, mom is acting protectively. Again, from a domestic violence lens, this is very problematic because it's an assumption that somehow mother's action is going to be able to create safety for her children when the person who's causing the harm and the person who's creating lack of safety is the person who's perpetrating domestic violence. And then the third reason, most common reason, was because the children don't appear to be affected by the incident. And so we're going to go into that in a second. But let me just summarize where we are so far. So domestic violence actually counts for a substantial and a meaningful proportion of all child homicides. It deserves more attention. The risk factors for domestic violence lethality are equally applicable to understanding risk to children. And child welfare may be overlooking these critical indicators of risk. Okay, so then let's talk about the impact of child exposure to domestic violence. And I know that you've had quite a bit of this today. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of it. I just want to touch on a couple of things that I think are most important. I think one of the things you've heard quite a bit about today is this countering this idea that domestic violence is an adult issue, but it's really a condition of children's lives. I just want to emphasize that children are inevitably part of patterns, and I've used fathers here because often fathers are the person who's behaving abusively, but they're inevitably part of patterns of abuse. So parents consistently underestimate children's exposure. We know younger children are in fact more likely to be exposed and they're developmentally more vulnerable to impact. We also know from research done not too long ago in the UK, children are able to describe nuances. They're able to describe coercive control, the tactics that the perpetrating parent is using, as well as the resultant effects. And children are often brought into coercive control as direct victims. So a perpetrating parent may aggressively insert themselves into everyday routines. They may use children as a pawn, like a competition. They may attempt to corrupt the child's view of the other parent. They may violate children's boundaries, particularly around separation issues. And there was a recent infographic put out by Krivak, by the center, around the coercive control during intimate partner violence. And I highlight this in case it's a free downloadable resource that gives some examples of children experiencing coercive control in the context of intimate partner violence. This is a little bit from the Safer. This is a corresponding session. And if you don't know about the Safer tool, I suggest that you look it up. One of the things the Safer tool does is helps to think about the many ways that children may be exposed to intimate partner violence, including all of these things during pregnancy, direct harm, witnessing, experiencing the aftermath, having the knowledge of the violence. But just a few examples of what does this look like? So here's a 10-year-old who says, lots of times when mom was giving me attention, he'd tell her to go over to him so she'd have to leave me to play by myself. Or he went to my mother's workplace to threaten her and we couldn't stay because we had to go in some other place. Or when my mom gets money, he takes it off of her. And, I don't say anything. So we don't get any money. So these are instances of children who are really explaining instances of coercive control and abuse and violence and have a pretty good understanding of what's going on and why. So not only do children, or not only do they know about and they're impacted and they're often directly involved in abusive behavior, there are a number of things that I kind of think of, it's actually worse than that. And the reason that it's worse than that is because mothering is often a focus of men's abusive and coercively controlling behavior. So, a way in which a perpetrating parent can abuse the victim parent is to put down and degrade their parenting, to make disparaging comments about them as a parent, to threaten to report them as a parent. And then, especially when that happens, children cannot help but feel involved and often responsible for problems. When there's minimization and denial by the abuser or by anybody else in the home, it leads children to question the validity of their own distress. And then what do? Is they learn to attribute those reactions to a flaw in themselves rather than a reasonable reaction to the situation. And they're also impacted through the effects of domestic violence on their parents. And so some of those are the trauma of the victim parent, their credibility or authority could be compromised. They may end up needing to use a compensatory parenting style. And it's hard enough to be a parent, I would say, to add being a parent onto dealing with abuse. And trying to do that, I think just makes parenting all that more difficult and deal with the extra harm to the children. So overall, then the impact of child exposure to domestic violence goes well beyond the fear and helplessness that children may feel in response to any sort of domestic violence incident, but becomes an integral part of children's experience of their parent and their home. And I want to show you a digital story. This is a digital story produced in Australia. These were teens that were who had experienced violence and were invited to create a digital story to share with their perpetrating parent. And I want to show you one of those stories. So just in terms of what you're going to hear a child who is telling the story to in this case, their father, about what it was like for them.
My phone is the one thing that I feel keeps me safe. It means that when you do something to me, at least I can call someone for help. When I saw you yesterday, I was so scared. You asked me to leave my phone in the glove box. You said I wouldn't need it. But I remember what happened last time. I remember that day so clearly. We were out for lunch. I was trying to express my feelings. All that would come out were words like, I hate you. You got up and slapped me across the face. You took my phone, you locked me in a room. I couldn't call anyone. I thought you would hurt me again. Luckily, before you took my phone, I sent a quick message to Mum that you slapped me. After that, I didn't want to see you anymore. Would you want to see someone who physically and emotionally hurts you? So when you tried to take my phone yesterday, I said no. I said I don't really like you. I would rather spend my weekends doing something else than seeing you. You said that's okay, you just won't have a father anymore. Even though I don't want to spend time with someone who hurts me emotionally and physically, it still makes me upset that you don't make an effort to be there. I shouldn't have to feel unsafe and scared around you. You are meant to be there for me. It all started when I was little. You used to come and go. Some days you would be there and then you wouldn't. Why? I was little and I didn't understand. You started drinking a lot and you and Mum would always start fighting. You didn't think I saw it, but I did. I saw a lot. I saw a lot more than I wanted to. You and Mum split up, and at that time I didn't understand why. But now I do. Mum was getting hurt, emotionally and physically, by you. The reason I got my phone was to contact you, to talk to you. Now my phone has become something it shouldn't. It's something I need to keep me safe from you.
Okay, what I'd like us to do actually now, I'm going to ask you to use the chat if I can. The point of going through this and talking about impact in this way, in the many different ways, it's to try to remind us of how important it is to really get into the mind of or the potential experience of children and how they're making sense of their lives and what's happened. So I'm wondering if there's anything, if you can think of anything that might stand out to you in that video about how that child may have um, understood that, what the impact has been that's beyond, okay, I was exposed to violence. What kind of impact did you hear about in that video that goes beyond and is an example of the way that that child's experience of their family and their parents has been changed as a result of domestic violence? It's a big ask for late in the afternoon. Okay, I will I will take a shy audience and we'll go on. I want to talk just a little bit more and give you just a little bit more around the impact of domestic violence on child outcomes. I want to talk here a little bit about co-parenting. So co-parenting here doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as co-parenting in a legal context. Here, it's defined as the extent to which a parent respects and values the other parent's contribution and is able to work together with the other parent to communicate and problem solve. One of the things that I think that I didn't realize until I really started reading this literature is that this co-parenting, the way in which parents um, can respect and value the other, is a consistent predictor of outcomes for children, outcomes being emotional and behavioral problems for children. And perhaps non-intuitively, it's a more important predictor in separated couples than it is in intact couples. And although, immediately I think, well, wait a second, well, the kids aren't exposed to as much. If you think about how a child needs to make sense of their life and where they are when parents are separated and they're moving back and forth, they're really more alone in making sense of their lives. It may make sense then that it's more predictive and separated than intact couples. The other thing to know is that it's also more predictive for fathers parenting and fathers' relationship with their children than for mothers. So that aspect of co-parenting um, is more important for both fathers' parenting behavior and fathers' relationship with their kids. And for moms, the relationship tends to run more directly from parenting to child outcomes. Now, here we were talking about co-parenting in non-domestically violent families. So we wanted to explore a little bit more about what that would mean in domestically violent families. So I'll tell you a little bit about a study we did called Fathers and Kids in Toronto. What we were trying to do is understand how domestically violent fathers impacted their child's development. We recruited about 200 fathers. This was pre-COVID. About 100 of them had a confirmed history of domestic violence, and about 100 were recruited from the community. That they were similar. We were very careful to try to recruit to make sure that the groups that we had were comparable on key demographic variables, including age and level of father-child contact and education, and also in terms of their diversity. And what we were looking at is the extent to which domestic violence predicted outcomes. What other things were really important? What other aspects of men's parenting were important? And what other aspects of men's co-parenting were important? So I'm not going to go through all of the details, but if you're a psychologist, you might really like this. So what we did is we really took a look at multiple different variables, and what the take-home message from this diagram is just as I just talked to you about, this aspect of co-parenting is a really important predictor. So part of the reason or part of the way in which father's domestic violence perpetration impacts children is through lack of co-parenting respect and lack of communication. And in fact, both of these variables were more important than fathers rejecting parenting and fathers' hostility in terms of predicting outcomes for children. So the take home from this is back to that question. So in a domestically violent family, how important is that relationship between mom and dad? How important is it that dad is able to behave in a reasonably respectful way and valuing the contribution of the other parent? How important is it to child outcome? It's very important. It is in fact as important, if not more important, than the direct relationship between father's parenting and child outcomes. How was communication measured? So in this case, we've done this a couple of different ways. In this case, in this graph, what we're looking at is fathers' reports, self-reports of their co-parenting in the dimension of co-parenting communication and dimension of co-parenting respect on the parenting alliance measure. I'm not going to show this here, but we also did observation. So we actually had an observational measure of um, of moms and dads talking to each other in a few of the cases. You see the same pattern. And another thing we did is we had fathers do narratives. So we have another study where we looked at fathers' narratives where they answered two questions. One was what's it like parenting? Tell me a little bit about what your partner is like as a parent, and tell me a little bit about what it's like when you parent together. And again, we kind of coded that and looked at how fathers' way of describing their communication or their respect for their partner influenced child outcomes. Thank you for that question. So we did it in a number of different ways is the answer. I think then I was just talking about child internalizing and externalizing problems. I think some of our other literature, and so there's meta-analyses and also multiple other studies that talk about the impact of domestic violence on infants, children, and adolescents, show an association between exposure to domestic violence and PTSD, talk about both direct and indirect effects. We know that effects may vary by severity, but also age and gender and siblings and the role that that child and the meaning that child is making. Um, We know that healing is facilitated by safety and stability and access to formal and informal supports. I'm not going to talk about this, but I will. As I said, the SAFER is a great tool. Here's another little bit of the SAFER, which directs you while you're doing this tool to think about the impact of domestic violence in multiple different domains, including, to what extent has it created concerns for the child's physical safety or emotional well-being or development or security or health or their relationships, their behavior, or their thinking and perceptions. And here is the second half of the infographic I showed you earlier that talks about things that you can do or ways to respond that are helpful for children who've been exposed to or experienced or lived with intimate partner or domestic violence, including children in safety planning with their non-abusive parents, listening to their experiences, encouraging coping and calming strategies, and supporting and helping children be able to articulate their understanding of their experience, and then be able to provide supportive adults interpretation of those experiences. Okay, so again, I'll go back to child welfare and I'll ask the question, how is child impact is or is not seen within child welfare files? What we have been doing is we've been giving child welfare workers cases. We've given them it's a as if you have an intake. It has information about the family, and in this case, what form of abuse was verified, a bit about the referral, a bit about history, a bit of an update after a month of service. And the questions that are asked is to identify the risks to the child, create an intervention plan for the family, and then how do you know this case should be closed? So back to my theme that I think that we still have some work to do in child exposure to domestic violence cases in child protection context. Most of the time, there was very little in terms of domestic violence risks that were identified. Here we've got some identified. The most common risk factor identified is a history of domestic violence. When we look at the intervention plan, there was often no domestic violence referral for any member of the family. So even though what we've just talked about the impact on children of domestic violence, there was very seldom a referral for the child to a program that could address the potential impact of domestic violence. And indications of closing seem to be really focused on, as I said, separation, or an admonishment to both parents to prevent the child from being there when they were fighting, rather than sort of a really well articulated reason that included some intervention or some support for the child. I'll also, because I don't want to pick on child protection is something that I work a lot with, and I think there's a really great potential within child protection to shift this dynamic and to recognize the needs of children in the context of these families in a way that recognizes patterns of abuse and recognizes survivor strategies, and recognizes risk for lethality. I think there's lots of good things to happen. I like David Mandel's work in this area as well. In terms of family court, this is the work of the Family Law Project around how child impact is or is not seen in the family court system. We did interviews with over 100 survivors of near domestic homicide or family members of people who had survived, of people who had been killed in domestic homicide. And a common and consistent theme was women reporting that the people they interacted with did not understand the impact, in particular of non-physical violence, and didn't understand the safety risks that they were facing, and that those safety risks were equally applicable to their children. One woman talked about being just flabbergasted that the court could overlook these kinds of concerns. Like they really didn't see the risks of domestic violence and how they applied to children. A useful tool in understanding child impact or understanding ongoing abuse and coercive control in the context of separation is the post-separation power and control wheel. If you haven't seen it, it's worth looking up. It talks about and helps to um, address the myth that once separated, you're safe, and shows all the different ways that a person can continue to be abused following separation, how the court can be brought into that, and how that continues to impact and endanger children. Um, and I'll just say in general, my take on the research is that child exposure to domestic violence is really not well recognized. And one of the studies that I really value in this area is Holtzworth Monroe multi-door dispute resolution study, where they did a randomized control trial looking at parents seeking to resolve separation or divorce related disputes and reporting high levels of intimate partner violence. And so the comparison was really traditional legislation, shuttle mediation, and video conferencing mediation. And the study is worth reading for its conclusions around that. I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to do is, when I heard this study, one of the things that really struck me was the impact, the level of violence we were talking about, and then what happened. So when we looked at these cases, 79% of moms and 40% of fathers in the cases examined reported fe- feeling fearful, scared, and of physical harm to themselves or others. There'd been arrest in almost 40% of the cases. There'd been protection orders in a number of cases. Despite that, parents in these cases, in the vast majority of cases, were granted joint legal custody. Um, Most of them, the documents didn't address concern around any assessment or concern about lethality. Um, Fewer than 5% involved referrals of any member of the family to a counseling service. And these findings are replicated over and over in Canada, in Italy, in the UK. What that means is really that current parenting arrangements often result in domestically violent parents and often fathers spending more time parenting their children post separation, as well as having more responsibility for their children post separation, setting up this a situation that when we're not actually doing a proper DV risk assessment, when we're not looking at risk factors for lethality, we put ourselves in a situation of not really responding to the needs of children. Um, just because I can't avoid stepping into things that are controversial, um, it's useful to know that when cross allegations of parental alienation are made, they reduce the likelihood of abuse being believed by about a factor of 2. Okay. This is a diagram that's been around for a long time, but I think it's a really useful visual for family court, where what it is articulating is really a differentiated kind of family court response that's needed to domestic violence. So then rather than stay on the highway of what always happens for cases, there needs to be some early screening, some early assessment, and an off ramp for a specialized response that is appropriate to dealing with domestic violence. And that will give me to this um, diagram at the end with what we should be doing. And that's true in family court, it's true in child protection, and I think it's true in general, is one of the things that we really need to start thinking about as the very base of our work with domestic violence is better recognition of the harm to children living with domestic violence. And when I say better recognition of the harm, I think we all sort of think about child exposure as being harmful. But what I hope you're taking away from this is a little bit more depth and nuance in the multiple ways that children are harmed when they're living with domestic violence. Added to that, we need to assess risk specifically and think about risk for lethality specifically for children. We need to safety plan with children, include children also in risk management. So talking to the protective parent about what needs to happen for safety, talking to the perpetrating parent about about their motivation to keep their kids safe and what is going to take to do that. And then the value of collaboration among courts and community agencies, including child protection. So my final thoughts, we know that domestic violence impacts children. We know, in fact, we need to do a better job at recognizing lethality risks in thinking about children when we're thinking about that. And that really does mean we need to better recognize and assess domestic violence, period. And I would say that we need to better account, at least where I am, for the impact in particular in child welfare and in family court. I would also add in child mental health. And so I will leave you with a hope and a thought for you to think and reflect on what you might be taking away from this. In particular, I will ask you to think about taking something away that comes from that place that I started with, which is fundamentally, I started as a child clinical psychologist. So what might you take away in your own work? Where can you bring your children's eyes a little bit more closely, or children's experience a little bit closer to everything that you do, so that the experiences of children and the realities of children are sort of front and center as much as possible in your mind? Thank you.
That's terrific, Dr. Scott. Thank you very much. We are wrapping a little bit early, so as I make some announcements, that'll just give you a last chance to get a question in if you're in the middle of typing one. This is our final session of the day, and we'll be returning tomorrow morning at double check 9 a.m. We'll go straight into breakout sessions. So there won't be a large session first. We'll start in breakouts and then we'll end with large sessions tomorrow. So be sure to check your program for the links to find your way to the right spot. We'll just double check the chat. It looks like we don't have any further questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for being with us and sharing this really important and useful information. We appreciate your time today. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.